All right, we are back with Jordan Tsai, owner of Santa Monica Physiotherapy and physiotherapist for CLOUD9, Evil Geniuses, and TSM. I didn't realize you're working with TSM now. That's cool.
Yeah. I'm actually I don't personally work with them. I have in the past, but one of my coworkers, Jen, she's actually the PT for them, and she jumped on with Respawn Therapy, which is the esports side of my business.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I saw that you guys picked her up. That's pretty sweet that you're kind of expanding, picking up some more people in the esports industry. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah. She actually works with me at Santa Monica PT, so it's kind of an easy one. And she actually introduced me to Cloud9. She's been in esports longer than I have. She just has only been really working with one team, so I had the vision to like, well, let's talk to other teams, and she was kind of like, well, it's kind of her side job. So, but yeah, she's a great resource for me, and I think we're very lucky to have access to so many teams.
Yeah, that's unreal. So last time we kind of talked about esports as a whole, kind of a very general conversation, but touched on a lot of topics. Today, I want to dive a little deeper on the kind of exercise science side of things because it's definitely one of those areas where, kind of as we mentioned before, there's not a lot of research in esports because it's so new. And like, especially in Canada, the approach that we're trying to take at Gamer to Athlete is like, not only making people healthier and kind of aware of the importance of an active lifestyle when it comes to those casual gamers, but trying to approach esports performance training from an exercise standpoint and see how that can help their actual gaming performance. Because I feel like up until this point, and I know you guys do a lot of stuff with like, I mean, you're a physio, like ergonomics, that kind of thing, dealing with those injuries. But I feel like a lot of performance training in esports is, I mean, they have their main practice, they have like their scrims, which is actually like high intensity practice, and then some people use programs like Kovacs to work on like their aim and that kind of thing. But in terms of like the exercise realm, there isn't really a lot that's really aimed at performance other than, if someone's in pain, that's going to affect their ability to focus. I know you talked about that a bit before. Like
Yeah.
what is the kind of perception of exercise in the esports industry, at least at that high level?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the hard things is, unlike traditional athletes in other sports, there's no exercise that directly translates into performance on stage for these guys. So the buy-in is a little bit tougher because you have to kind of convince them that indirectly, them having a healthier body is going to lead to greater success. So I think a lot of teams now are recognizing that at the bare minimum, player health should be the primary concern. So they do a lot of cardio. Most of the teams have trainers that come in and work with the guys. And it's usually kind of a general strengthening principle of, okay, let's get them running, let's get them moving, let's improve their overall mobility, strength, all that stuff. Pretty basic, just being healthy type exercises. But in my perspective, I've worked with some of the trainers who work with Cloud9 too, and we've talked about a lot about what should we prioritize that might actually benefit them in some way on stage. And so what I've tried to focus on is a lot of retraction type exercises to kind of reverse those postures that they spend a lot of time in. I've tried to develop muscles that kind of get relatively weak because of what their activity level is and what they tend to be doing all the time. So core musculature, back retractors, even legs. They're hitting a lot of legs now. And so the best thing was, going over to the house and talking to some of the guys, and they're like, I actually never deadlifted anything in my life before, and now they have really, really good form. So I'm like, that's a huge change, and you see that in general society where people can't do a good squat or a good deadlift. And so I think it's really beneficial for these guys that they're learning a little bit about their bodies generally. I think that priority, in my opinion, should be focused on cardiovascular strength and core strength, as well as positional or postural strength. So those are generally the three areas that we try to spend the most time on, because it's not like they have to do a cut maneuver or anything like that. Balanced stuff like that. Things they would traditionally train in other athletes, it aren't really a big consideration for them. It's more about the indirect benefits. So most of that's like cardiovascular training and all like the stuff you mentioned too, in-game skills training.
Yeah, because the KPIs are obviously totally different. And I think that's a good point that you brought up, though, is like having that general body awareness. Like, that's why I feel like as a strength coach, if you're someone coming into this industry, like this exercise, health, fitness, whatever, you should have experience working with clientele that have very little awareness of their body, because you'll realize how much different you have to approach, teaching them technique and cueing them to move properly. And even again, going back to the deadlift, he's a researcher, a professor, close to where I did my master's actually, and he did a presentation one time. He works with a lot of like older individuals. We have a pretty large like elderly population here, and so there's a lot more money in research there. But it's interesting because he did this whole presentation basically around how he uses the deadlift to teach people postural control, because it's one thing to do external rotation or traction exercises, but then to actually put those pieces together and incorporate them into your daily movement. It's like, yeah, okay, I'm playing league, I don't need to know how to deadlift, but that's an important piece of moving properly and being healthy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And that's actually, to go back to the first part of your statement, I really like that. If you're an athletic trainer trying to get involved with esports, you're not training traditional athletes. I think the thought process has to be a little bit closer to, I'm training someone who's been sedentary their whole life and now wants to get into some sort of fitness. So you can have your ATC, all these athletic training certifications, but very little of it's actually applicable to training these people as athletes. It's probably closer to a general personal training type mentality of, okay, this person's never ever worked out in their life before. And this doesn't hold true across the board, because there are some of these guys who I've worked with who are actually very into fitness and very into their bodies. But as a general whole, it's more likely that you're going to see people who have never been in a gym, have never really ran, and are kind of novices at that kind of stuff. So I think starting with the fundamentals, like you said, I consider the bench press, the pull up, the deadlift, squat. Those are all basic fundamental movements that humans should, if you can do all those things well with good form, everything is easier, right? Like everything you do in life, carrying things, picking things up, pushing things, it just makes your overall performance better. So yeah, I totally agree with that. Starting with the basics and building fundamental strength, usually then you can get into more advanced stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, going back to basics, like even for us, when it comes to trying to apply these pieces of, cognitive research in the context of gamers, even though it hasn't really been applied there so much, um, if there's someone that has been sedentary, going from zero exercise to doing, a few 20-minute runs per week, that could equate to a lot of benefit, again, from like a cardiovascular metabolic standpoint. But then from what we kind of do know about, adaptations to cognition and brain function, we can get a lot of, chronic adaptations from just incorporating that aerobic fitness from like a cerebral standpoint as well. Because that's, again, what we're trying to do is, can we find a way to use this exercise acutely? Again, if we look at how much brain activity we get during high intensity exercise or aerobic activity, there's huge implications for potentially long-term performance improvements. And again, in Canada, like most of a lot of our population is elderly, so there's a lot of research in that area. But there is some interesting research on how high intensity exercise can improve cognition and memory in these elderly populations. And again, it's at a high intensity. And I find people don't often associate, being elderly with doing high intensity exercise, but we get all these amazing like cerebral and neurological changes. So, I mean, of course, they're not not quite as sharp as an 18-year-old or a 16-year-old.
Sometimes.
Yeah, you never know. But is there room for us to get those same types of adaptations, especially in someone that is very undertrained, right?
Yeah, I would think that if we compare just in high intensity exercise, you're talking about age populations, we see benefits in other types of training between populations as well, right? So the younger you are, the easier it is for you to put on strength, the easier it is for you to get faster, stronger, just more agile, even greater mobility with training. So usually you tend to see a quicker adaptation in the younger people. So I would think that any benefits that you're noticing in the elderly population should be magnified, if anything, in the younger population. Now, a lot of that's it's a little bit of hypothesis. I'm not sure. There's not a ton of comparative evidence on that, but we know for sure that things like cardiovascular endurance and building stamina, physiologic stamina, does translate into faster reaction times, quicker cognitive task problem solving. We see things like better memory, better pattern recognition. Everything should be operating at a higher level because you have better oxygenation. To me, that's kind of the baseline of this, is that blood flow equals oxygenation equals nutrients. Your brain functions better with that. So it makes sense that if you have more cardiovascular endurance than someone who's completely sedentary, you get better oxygenation to your brain, especially as games progress. So I think you're seeing that a lot now. A lot of these esports are transitioning to series type matches. So you're not just playing one game and you're done. League of Legends kind of being the outlier because it is about one game, which is almost an hour. But even in League, when you get into the higher levels of the tournaments, they're playing, knockout rounds. So it's 3 to 7 games sometimes, or 3 to 5 games, I'm sorry, that they have to play all the way through, and there's no breaks. So you might be sitting there for 5 hours. And in that fifth game, when everything is on the line, it's 2-2, winner moves on. If you're the one who's already fatigued and you're already mentally blanking and your reaction times have slowed, your decision making is impaired, you're probably not going to do very well in that next match with stress added on top.
Hmm.
So I think that, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of the benefits you get from exercise in this population is more secondary, but it is definitely stuff that you can see applied in real competition, because in, physiologic endurance, mental fatigue, stress, being used to stressing your body repeatedly helps build tolerance to that. All of that stuff indirectly makes you a better player.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a few points off that. When you talk about, yeah, increase cerebral blood flow, I know there's some research that also tries to suggest that we're increasing like catecholamine transportation as well, so we can get more kind of firing through that. Um, but I think that's like interesting logistically, going back to kind of the acute response. So if kind of look through like a decent amount of research, what I have found. So other than individuals that are highly trained that can get some kind of acute improvements in cognitive function from like moderate to high intensity exercise because they can tolerate that a little more, a lot of these like acute benefits seem to be from like shorter duration, fairly moderate intensity exercise. So just enough. The bottom end would be like getting over that adrenaline threshold, and then upwards of like 70-80% VO2 max.
Mhm.
And so 10 minutes is usually like the very minimum for like what would be considered even like a statistically non-significant improvement. But looking at like 20-30 minutes, we seem to get some sort of significant improvement in cognition from that level of exercise.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, again, if you're talking about a series, that's a lot of games. Like, if you're out there for game after game, like you mentioned, it's more about that endurance. And so it's like figuring out how we can incorporate this in to actually see an improvement. Like, is it worth it to have them do, I don't know, hop on a bike backstage and, do 20 minutes of
Yeah.
cycling
Yeah.
for a little boost? Or should we put more of our eggs in the basket of, okay, we're going to do more training on the back end of things so that when you get out there, you have the stamina to maintain that high level of functioning, right? I think there's
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
ways that we could go with it, but again, there's so little that's actually applied to like
Mhm.
esports right now.
Yeah, that's an awesome idea actually. Actually, I never really think about something like like a cardiovascular warm up. I have the guys do a lot of warm up exercises for their arms, hands, preparation type work, postural stuff, but an actual cardio warm up might prove beneficial, kind of based on what we're talking about. I think that the tricky thing would be you'd have to find a team or an organization willing to try something new,
Yeah.
and that's really tough. A lot of people are gonna look at that and be like, well, we might also just tire our players out. But if you've been training, look at any high level athlete, they get on that court, they warm up. For us, that'd be a workout. For them, it's like, okay, they're just priming their body to perform. And it should be relatively low compared to what they're used to doing in training. Kind of on that note too, intensity is a really interesting concept, because something I stress a lot of patients and a lot of clients. is that intensity is relative. Your level of intensity when you're doing something at a high level is going to be very different than someone else's. So I think a lot of these guys, their idea of high intensity with the benefits that they could get from high intensity training doesn't actually have to be that hard. You don't have to kill them with CrossFit type, like I'm going to have you do an AMRAP for 5 minutes and then you're going to just die. That's very, very high intensity. But some of these guys, if they haven't trained at all, high intensity might be running a mile and then doing like 10 push-ups. They might be gassed after that. So I think, it's important is that you're factoring in the individual person in all of these things and making sure that the parameters at which you're dosing exercise and everything is in line with what they're capable of doing.
Yeah, it's definitely all contextual. I think that's a great point. And it's good that we have a lot of tech out there that will allow us to kind of regulate that a little bit better. Like if you stick a heart rate monitor on a guy, you can see if he's going over under where he should be. But
that's a great point too. The wearable tech now is all over the place. And I know a certain company has like given free samples to like certain teams and they're just trying to get them out there. I don't think we have a great way of interpreting that data yet, but the fact that we can start collecting it is kind of the first step. So I think that's kind of what we need to do in the future is making sure that all these players are tracking all this stuff as much as possible.
hmm And yeah, I guess that's the next step is like, how do we, for us, the new facility I'm working at now, we use a lot of sport tech. We try to track as many kind of KPIs as we can. And a lot of that's for like monitoring fatigue. Even going back to the cardiovascular component, it's like we want to incorporate this exercise to facilitate and improve performance. But we have to know that cutoff of like what's going to be too much stress, right? And it's really hard to know, again, if intensity is very independent or dependent on the person. How do we know how much this person's going to recover from it? And it's nice, like I know what my HRV is pretty regularly. Went out last night, wasn't very good this morning, tell you that much. But being able to have those metrics and like regulate around that is so useful, but we need to, again, make sure we're not kind of allowing it to inhibit what we're doing out there. And I think that's what, again, as you mentioned, what a lot of people think is going to happen, even though we know there are all these health benefits to performing exercise and training. And again, it's about longevity, right? So if we keep going.
No, I was just say that you brought up the recovery. I think that's probably the most critical thing because for a lot of athletes, a lot of people, it's more about a lack of recovery than it necessarily is, oh, you're not training hard enough. Yes. I think a lot of people just lose sight of that. Like you don't build muscle when you're in the gym, it's always after. So if you're not recovering, there's no point in training 6 days a week if you're not actually getting that growth time in.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think I was discussing this with someone the other day, like the workout itself is the stimulus. What you're doing outside, that's the actual adaptation. So we put so much thought, and we put so much thought into the stimulus we're providing, but sometimes we put so little thought into what we're doing outside to actually get that adaptation be better. And again, that's why we choose to use so much tech is like if we have someone come in and we see that their RSI, the reactive strength index is down, we'll reduce volume or do what we need to, but then they think, well, like I need to do more because I need to get better. It's like you're completely missing the big part of it, right? And kind of connecting some dots here, going back to like the pre-competition engagement. I think a lot of guys, and I'm so guilty of this when I was like competing in powerlifting, because I was like, I need to have all my energy to like do my workout, get my big lifts in. But you can get so much out of like a really good warm up, right? Like we'll have people come in the gym and they're tired because maybe they had like a practice earlier that day and they still have to train and they're not feeling too hot. And we go through this long warm up and they're like, why are we going through this long warm up? I have to still get the workout in. But then they go into their jump testing and they're doing better. And it's because we're getting such a high level of engagement. And I had this study here, single bout of moderate aerobic exercise for improving motor skill acquisition. And so they had people basically do 30 minutes of moderate activity prior to like these cognitive tests, and they would find pretty consistently that they were getting like more accurate decision making from that exercise and actually learning skills a lot quicker than they would in the control group. And so
Hmm.
I've heard strength coaches kind of talk about this where if they're going into a new phase, incorporating new exercises, they'll actually have really long warm ups on that first day or that first week. And they find that the athletes tend to grasp onto things a lot quicker because when they actually get in there, they're already fired up, ready to go. Versus if you just kind of lazily go through this like 10-minute warm up, you go through the motions like you normally do,
Mhm.
you spend the first quarter of your workout basically finishing your warm up and getting yourself to a state where you can actually perform. And so
Yeah.
it's like this trade off of, maybe we're getting a little extra fatigue from an energy system standpoint, but we're getting so much on the neurological end of things, right?
Yeah.
So I feel
Yeah.
like there
That
must
makes a lot
be,
of sense. Yeah. That's really cool, actually. And that there's actually data on that, because that's kind of what we assume. We do a lot of stuff traditionally, right? But then sometimes, more often than not, when we start doing studies on this stuff, we get better data, we have better metrics. The science kind of backs up what we've already kind of known, right? Like a dynamic warm-up, you're just stretching beforehand to get blood flow into muscles, not static stretches, but priming the nervous system, priming the brain, priming all your muscles, getting warmed up. Like all of that generally has been known to translate into better performance. It's really nice now that we're getting more details on the duration and the intensity needed. But I think that's one of the big benefits of the wearable tech too, is that gives us numbers. And for someone to actually see the numbers, it makes it easier for them to understand it. So I think, yeah, getting a lot of these players with, Whoops and smartwatches, all that stuff, trying to get them to see the numbers and to understand that, hey, you slept 3 hours last night, even though you went to bed at 9, what's going on with that? And you find out, well, oh, I'm not sleeping very well. So what do we need to do to change your sleep habits? Are you drinking caffeine right before you pass out? Which, I know a lot of people do. So all that stuff is really, really nice when they can actually see it, versus the other side of it, which is what, like certain teams have done, is you have a very strict schedule. So all you guys need to be asleep by 9. That's really hard to actually enforce and have it stick, because they don't really understand why they have to be asleep at that time.
yeah, for sure. Little story. I have this 15-year-old female baseball player that I recently started working with, and she is great athlete, but like heavy like ADHD, like can't pay attention very well. Also talks herself down a lot, doesn't believe in herself very much. And so that's been a big part of training her is having her realize that you're a lot stronger than you think you are. You can do these movements and then showing her how those things work. Because a lot of her training up until now has just been specifically baseball. Like she's a great pitcher, but she just does not have the strength to keep kind of facilitating that improvement. But then she, always tells herself like I'm not strong enough to do this. And then, 4 weeks later, all her numbers are up. But having those numbers to show her that this is working was a big thing for her. And then outside of that, even, kind of subjective changes. One thing I introduced her to was like breathing protocols. And so she was one of those people that had a really tough time falling asleep, like would lie in bed 1 to 2 hours a night.
Mhm.
And I showed her these kind of breathing strategies, showed her, what proper like rib cage expansion compression should feel like, timing of your breaths. And she comes in the next day and she's like, I fell asleep in 5 minutes last night for like the first time ever. And it's such like a little thing, but to understand like how much that can affect someone's just like life in general, but their recovery and all these different components, and
Yeah.
for them to actually see that and feel that is a huge thing. And maybe that's kind of a big hump that we have to get over in the esports industry, is whether it's kind of having that subjective feedback and that experience or just having the numbers to show them that it makes all the difference, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. Breathing is definitely a very misunderstood or misused, I guess, part of training. But you're absolutely right. It's like a lot of that stuff ties into so many other systems, your parasympathetic response, all that stuff that indirectly affects recovery, affects everything else. Strength, if you're not breathing right, it's very hard to actually create enough stability in your core and your trunk to do anything strong. So you're right. Yeah, I think that's awesome. With the esports guys, it's definitely applicable, because most of them again aren't very highly trained in a lot of that kind of stuff, and I think that they spend a lot of their day in a very sympathetic, or I mean, basically a very amped up state.
Mm-hmm.
If they're playing games, it's immediately stressful. From the second they start, it's immediately slightly stressful. If they don't do well, it's even more stressful. And so I think more often than not, when they're, especially when they're practicing, when they're solo queuing, a lot of that stuff is just not very, it's not very peaceful in your mind. And so you might get into a flow state, you might do really well for a little bit, but long-term stress like that, it has been shown to also cause issues in the entire system. So knowing how to bring that down, create that parasympathetic response, use breathing to channel some of this, stressors down, that's super important. I think that can't be understated.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure if you saw that post that I put up a little while ago showing the tempo work I was doing with like the controlled breathing recovery.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, so to briefly repeat that, I was basically running 20 uphill, like 40-meter sprints. It's mostly running, so about 70% tempo runs, and then breathing through my nose in between. And nose breathing, like with activity or controlled breathing, it's one of those things where it's not necessarily more efficient, but the challenge it places on your system, like the amount of stress that it places in terms of like CO2 tolerance. Like we think about kind of like metabolic buildup. That's why one of the reasons people have like anxiety attacks. It's almost like a CO2 overload in their system, right? And their body's just trying to like get it out. So I think that has so much application with the research coming out showing that esports athletes are reaching heart rates of 140 to even like 180. Having that ability to kind of tolerate that buildup, especially when guys are like in a gunfight and they're holding their breath, like trying to get through it. And I feel like there's so much application there, but again, it's one of those things where it's like, you want me to think about my breathing? Like, are you serious? Like,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go for a run. It's gonna make me better at league. I don't know, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
I think that's exactly what we're talking about. It's the sell. Like you have to convince them that at some level this is going to actually help their game. It's not just, oh, we want you to be healthy. Like this is going to hopefully have direct impact on how well you actually play, how well you can learn new skills, how well you can pick up what the coaches are telling you. I think, there's so much benefit to it that is hard because, when you haven't trained very much at all, or you're just getting into a new training program, it kind of sucks. It doesn't feel good. You're putting your body through a lot of stress that it's not used to, especially physical stress. I can't tell you in my actual clinic how many patients who have really never worked out in their lives, when they get to a muscle burn for the first time in their lives, that's not a pleasant feeling. It's like
oh
that
yeah.
thing is on fire. You're hurting me. My leg is gonna fall off. I'm like, no, you're fatigued and you're pushing through it.
Yeah, how was teaching someone to deadlift for the first time and a few
Oh
days after,
yeah.
right? Like I've had
Right.
athletes that come and they're
Yeah.
like, I think I have to go to a chiro. It's like, no, this is what
Yeah.
muscle
I
soreness is like.
right. And you always kind of troubleshoot. You're like, well, my whole back hurts. I'm like, well, how high up does, is it one joint or no, it's my entire back. I'm like, you did good then. Like you used all those.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to do.
I think overall, like working out kind of helps build that in everyone, not just athletes or esports gamers, anything like that. It's just putting your body through something taxing that's hard and mentally tough for you to get through. If you do that repeatedly, it builds mental fortitude and the ability to kind of push yourself through discomfort, which I think translates into a lot of everyday skills. Like it's a very measurable thing you can do every day, that for 1 hour I'm going to make myself really uncomfortable and I'm going to keep doing it, and then once I'm done and you've accomplished something, hopefully to your benefit.
It's funny you mentioned that actually, because that was one of the things. There was a study, I don't have it opened here actually, but it was looking at mental toughness and longevity in esports. And they did find like a positive correlation. I can't remember exactly how they did it. I think it was like a survey of sorts. They did find a positive correlation between mental toughness and longevity in esports because, again, you do have a lot of guys out there. It's very competitive and aspects of it can be very toxic, but it is a lot of stress. So having, the capacity to kind of deal with that, especially if you're on a big stage like that, it's a lot. That's a lot of extra kind of information you have to filter out,
Right.
which sort of leads me actually into a different point here, um, just about how gamers tend to process information. So I'm going to just kind of read
Oh
this
yeah.
off here because I'm not going to be able to explain it very well. MRI studies have shown that in the posterior parietal cortex, so I believe this is an area of the brain that's mostly responsible in this context for like interpreting sensory information, mainly
Yeah.
visual.
Yep.
Decreases. You're smart. You know what's going on. Decreases in activity after, or sorry, decreases in activity are related to greater performance in esports, likely due to the fact that cognitive resources are being used more efficiently with greater gaming proficiency. So it's one of those things where, gamers, there's so much going on the screen. With practice, they're actually better able to like filter out this information. And what's interesting is it's kind of similar when we look at some of the research on kids playing violent video games and kind of the response that it evokes initially, and then in the long term, like they have this decreased, I believe it's P300 is like the signal. It's like a event related potential when you get some stimuli that's kind of different or unfamiliar from what you'd normally receive. You get this signal in your brain, and a lot of that's tied to cognition. So if you receive a stimulus of sorts, you're able to respond. And so what they found with, people playing violent video games is after time, they become desensitized to that stimulus. But then they're trying to imply from that by having a dampened response, you're going to become psychotic and want to start killing people, right?
That's a big jump, but
when they try to make these implications, it's like
yeah.
that's not really what's happening,
I
right?
wonder though if it's, and when you think of violent video games, we usually think of shooters.
Mm-hmm.
When you play any shooter, even one that's cartoony, right, like Valorant, not that violent really,
Mm-hmm.
but when you watch it, I wonder if it's because this is kind of something we see in other sports too, where the more you play, the more times you're reintroduced to very similar scenarios, but some things are different. The better
Mm-hmm.
you get at, like you said, just shutting down unimportant information and only paying attention to what you need to pay attention to. Oh, that's different. I need to look over there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think maybe that's that response that you're seeing decreased in the parietal lobe, because that's picking up new information. And for someone who's seen the same room a million times, when they walk into it again, there's probably very little input from that room unless something is off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, because maybe that's also why we see certain players who've played longer. They talk a lot about reaction time, all that stuff. And I think a lot of research nowadays debunks the idea that if you're younger, you're necessarily faster than someone who's older within a certain age range, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So like an 18-year-old versus a 30-year-old, there's actually, I think it's less than 0.06% or 0.06 milliseconds response time lag. It's not a significant amount. It's definitely not appreciable in any sort of human measuring capacity. But I think when you see really veteran or elite players, they are better at putting themselves in situations prior to not have to intake as much information to react to what they expect. So in that sense, I think that's what you're getting at, is that when you get into a scenario, let's say you're clearing a room for a millionth time and your practice, where you need to stand, which direction the enemy is most likely going to be. You're going to enter with a preconceived idea of, okay, this is what I expect. And then so when you see everything, it either matches what you expect or it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of times, and most times, because they're veteran players, they know the game really well, it matches what they expect. So there's very little response time needed. They're like, oh, I knew this guy was going to be in this corner. It comes around, there he is, boom, headshot. And there's very little reaction to it. It's more anticipation.
Kind of going back to that post talking about implicit memory, like if you're constantly going to be experiencing, if you're constantly playing against bots that are relatively in the same position, you're probably not getting better at the game, because you're super familiar with what's going on around you, but nothing's really changing, right? You know what pieces, I mean, in the competitive scene, like, what pieces are going to be constant, and that's going to be like the map basically. And then you relatively understand, I guess, depending on the game, like if there's a certain team composition, you have to know what to expect from that competition, or from that composition, how those characters interact, how they build off each other's strengths or weaknesses. But how they actually execute that is going to vary to some extent, right? And so you have to, like you said, you have to be able to respond to those differences. Here's kind of an interesting one, slightly different. So, and the reason I thought this was interesting is because with sports, especially in Germany, so let's go back a little bit here. I had an athlete, a powerlifting / strong woman athlete from Germany. And when she was in school, they had a bunch of practitioners come in and do all these anatomical measurements and strength tests with every student in the class, and basically try and select them for Olympic sports. And so this woman that I ended up training, she was like one of the top in the class, like insanely strong for her age, and they wanted to actually put her in a certain sport. And because we know that, if you have a certain structural build or muscle fiber composition, like you're probably going to be better at a certain thing. It's like
Mhm.
we don't want to put someone else's we don't want to brush off someone's hard work and say genetics, claim genetics, but a lot of the time
Right.
genes are going to make a huge difference, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So, interesting study here. I kind of want to give me a sec. I'm going to read through this.
Mhm.
In an examination of gaming as an addiction, changes in the structure of the thalamus and left cingulate gyrus, am I pronouncing that right?
Gyres.
Good, gyrus. Structure have been identified as MRI markers of extended video gaming. As a result, the authors propose that these MRI identified markers could be used to categorize groups based on their amount of video game play as opposed to less reliable self-report questionnaires. Um, Importantly here, moreover, these authors found that career length in professional gamers positively correlated with increased cortical volume in the right superior frontal gyrus, right superior parietal gyrus, right precentral gyrus, and that winning rates in this group were associated with prefrontal cortex thickness. So my thought here is, can we start screening esports athletes to be potentially better because of like cerebral structure basically? Do you ever think that that could be a thing like 20, 30 years down the road from now where they're literally scanning kids' brains to see if they
That's yeah, that's super interesting because that'd be the equivalent of us, like you said, looking at kids in elementary school doing biopsies of their muscles, like, oh, you got a ridiculous amount of type 2 muscle fibers, like, and then you should go into this. I think that there's two things about that. One, how do we know that these brain changes were prior to them gaming this long, or is this an adaptation based on practice? We don't really know that, and
mm-hmm.
we also don't really know what that means in terms of how good they are at the game. Because I mean, what I've seen, at least anecdotally, again, there's a lot of esports athletes, or a lot of pro gamers are good at a variety of games.
Mm-hmm.
And so they might be a pro in League of Legends, but one of them I know for sure. When the Valorant beta came out, he hit like the top tier in that game in 3 days, and I was like,
Wow.
"You don't even play shooters?" And he's like, "Well, I used to be almost a pro in CS:GO, and I just switched to League of Legends." And I'm like, so I wonder in his brain, like, wonder what changes there are, and if it's especially because esports is so diverse, does that mean that you're just good at video games because you can process information really quickly and you can make good decisions, your reaction times? Or is it that some people are going to be better adapted to certain games? Because we don't really know that.
Hmm.
I think it's mostly a matter of how much time they've spent on it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really interesting that you could go from league to a shooter and be that good. I guess
Yeah.
the Counter Strike background definitely helps because that's a definitely more competitive shooter. Um,
Mhm.
and I find you see that sometimes in, I want to say football, like American football is a big one where you can take an athlete, put them in gear, teach them the game.
Mhm.
If they're a great athlete, like you're playing one position, your knowledge doesn't have to be that broad. Like when I went from
Right.
playing football to playing rugby, I suddenly had to learn how to kind of play my part on every part of the field depending on how the play was going. It wasn't just offense, defense. There's definitely situations where you can take an athlete and move them between sports. If they're very athletic, they're probably going to do decently well. But at the end of the day, when it comes to like high level university or professional level, as much as we train these guys, as much as we, get their speed or strength up, if their knowledge of the sport is just so deep, so refined that they always know where they're supposed to be, it's generally going to take them a little farther or kind of take them farther than, us getting this guy's 40 time up. Like if
Right.
he has athleticism and is talented and just knows how to play football really well, he's probably going to make it farther than the underdog who train their ass off like this many hours a day, 7 days a
Yeah.
week, right?
That's kind of the interesting thing about traditional sports too, that you bring it up. There are people who are genetic freaks, and we see them all the time. The LeBron James of the world. Like, you physically will not beat that person in the same game.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot of people who were cross sport athletes or two sport athletes in high school, three sport athletes. You see that a lot in your example, football, right? A lot of football players were also basketball players, or they were also track athletes. And so I think they take advantage a little bit of their genetic components of being able to be faster, stronger, bigger, and they do really well with training. But then there's also those guys who, if you look at them physically, Tom Brady jumps to mind, right? He's very, very gifted. Don't get me wrong. He's not a normal human being. He's super tall, really strong, actually is in better shape than 99% of us. But when you compare him to the freak athletes in the NFL, he looks not athletic, right? He's not the guy you think of when you're like, oh, who's got the fastest 40? Who's got the strongest arm? But for whatever reason, his genetic makeup and his training and his practice have actually turned him into one of the best football players of all time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it'd be really hard for any organization, looking in hindsight, to say, looking at his draft day, right, his combine stats, you wouldn't say, okay, this guy's going to be the future MVP of all time. Like, he's not going to win 6 Super Bowls,
Yeah.
So I think it's really, really dangerous for orgs to kind of put too much credence into physiologic makeup. I think it's important, but it's all, obviously things like wingspan, height, those will always be factors in traditional sports. In esports, it might be something like you're alluding to with maybe brain composition or brain makeup, but that's really, really tough to compare unless we have some sort of evidence that comes, like, what if this enlargement of this one gyrus, like you mentioned, is actually significantly correlated over thousands of players to actually equate to better aim. That might actually be kind of interesting. It's not to say that someone who doesn't have that can't have good aim, because anyone can have good aim on a good day, but maybe someone is just genetically predisposed to have a better reaction to something. Yeah, that's kind of scary, but also kind of cool.
Yeah, and I think brain structure is like a bigger reach, because like you can have a guy with huge legs that isn't necessarily fast, and then in
Right.
addition to that, you can have a guy that's fast but sucks at the game, right?
Yeah.
So I think it would be cool to have. There's ways you can do this. Like, again, that's what people use Kovacs for. They can click the cubes or
Yep.
whatever, they
Yep.
get a score. Like, but a way of standardizing cognitive components. And again, they do this in research, but relating it back to esports specifically and being able to
Yeah.
track those improvements in that KPI.
I think that's what a lot of companies and a lot of teams are trying to do now, is find quantifiable data to measure performance. There's a lot of data scientists out there that are specifically focused on esports, and how do we create metrics to track actual performance rather than did you win or did you lose? How many kills did you have? There's so many other factors at play because it's so convoluted. When you think about like esports, professional esports versus traditional sports, there's so many millions of other variables going on, especially in the more complex games where there's multiple types of characters. There's literally millions of team compositions. There's so many factors. It's like, how do you compare who's actually better? Because especially on a team game, you
Mm-hmm.
might be the best player on your team, and because your team's just bad, how do you compare that player to someone who's mediocre but on a really good team? Like, do they just shine because they have so much pressure taken off of them, or is other person not as good but they've had to carry their team for years?
That's
It's really hard to measure that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. And especially in games where if it is a team-based game and you have characters that are so different, if you're playing like a hit scan character, yeah, you need to be able to aim. Like, that's the biggest part of what you do. But if, you're playing Overwatch and you're playing, say, like
Yeah, like a
Winston,
tank.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like it's so much more just like position based and knowing
Right.
when to push, when to pull back, and work with your team. So yeah, there's so many factors at play, and kind of like we discussed before, everything is very controlled from, like a mathematical standpoint, but there's so much diversity in what can actually occur. So yeah, it's such like a new interesting area that some well-known strength coaches have said, like, esports is kind of the new wild west of performance. And
Yeah.
I think it's going to be cool once we have more money to put into that research. And I think once we actually start to see and look at these factors, it's gonna really blow up on the performance side of things.
Absolutely. I think what it's going to take is for teams or organizations to start looking ahead and start trying to put some of their marketing dollars, some of their money into looking at research, because the first team to get usable data is going to have a huge leg up. And I think until teams are willing to invest in it, it's always going to be this kind of reverse Cold War where nobody wants to be the first person to pull the trigger on it. But it's coming. Like there's going to be a point at which the threshold of money in this is going to exceed a certain amount. And people are like, okay, we have to look at everything now, which is what you've seen in other sports. The NBA, the NFL, all these other sports that have so much money in them, the teams can't afford not to be on the cutting edge of every little bit of possible performance benefit.
Yeah, and at that highest level, when you're literally fighting for percentages, fraction of percentages, like
Mm-hmm.
if it means dumping in thousands, hundreds of thousands, billions of dollars into something that's going to give you that edge, I think it's only a matter of time, really. So,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
and we're already seeing it. There's definitely already companies. Microsoft's heavily involved with this. There's already other major organizations that are putting data science into play with esports. So we've seen partnerships like Cloud9 and Microsoft is a big one, but they're getting access to data that other teams don't have, and it's not regulated because
wow.
it's new. They're not tracking anything that isn't available. It's just that, okay, they have an AI, or they have data scientists crunching these numbers and condensing it into a report. That's something that most teams don't have. So they have a massive advantage in that sense of at least just having something to look at. It doesn't always translate to wins, but I think having more information is always preferable to having less.
Hmm. And yeah, to kind of go off that, like if you're playing a game, generally that information is pretty readily available, right? Like you can see
Yeah.
people's stats and the results of a
Yep.
game, their headshot accuracy, whatever it may be. So it's yeah,
Yeah.
it's there. It's just like you have to be able to
Well,
know what to do with it, right?
in league, it's like it's really common for you to track other pro players, and you can look at their stats online because Riot makes all that public information. You can see their solo queue games, you can see how they're doing, you can see what champions are playing. And so traditionally what teams would do, they'd have their coach or their assistant coach be scouting those other players that they're about to play. They compile it in a report and they give it to the players. The advantage of what the data scientists are doing is they're doing that, but they're also adding in so many other things. Like not only do you know what they played, who they played as, you can look at, okay, how much time did they spend in mid lane? How much time did they roam? How much jungle pressure did they exert? All that stuff that a regular human coach can't honestly sit there and put that much time into to develop that. Their exact gold difference over the course of a game. Like this is all built into one report and it's done by computer. So it's basically instant. And then they have even more time to analyze that data because you're not spending time collecting it. So it exponentially increases how much value you're getting out of the same information.
That's wild. That's actually crazy. So like the
Yeah.
analysis of esport play and performance could potentially be a lot deeper and diverse than actual like regular traditional sports potentially,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think that the big problem traditional sports has with trying to create data like that is how do you measure it? Motion analysis cameras have only recently started being put into like arenas and courts. You can't get the data easily. The benefit in esports is this is all a computer game. So the data is already there. They just take it. It's
Hmm.
like it's all the replays are saved. You can just immediately you can have instant data right after the game's over because it's already right there. There's no processing time. You don't have to analyze any film really. I think that comes after. You definitely do film breakdown, but the actual data of okay, how much time did it take for this jungler to clear this part of the map is finite and it's pinpoint, and you can go right to it right after the game's over. What was his exact pathing? How much time did he spend, farming this one camp or whatever? Like it's crazy because in other games like CS:GO and all that, they save all the replays. You can go back right after the game and like he waited here for exactly 4 seconds, turned right, and then went this way, and he does that every single game. Like that's ridiculous information.
That is insane. That is
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah, that's wild. This has been really cool. This
Yep.
is a really cool discussion. So hopefully that gives some insight to any followers that are big into kind of exercise training and where kind of the future of performance is leading in the esport area. And again, I think this continues to justify esports being categorized as a real sport, being truly competitive because it's so diverse and we can get such a deep look into what's going on, and it's tough. It's
What
not easy.
I appreciate you having me on again as always, but what I'd love to get into next time we have a chance to talk, VR, and
Oh,
where does that lead? Like, are you now you're combining all of this stuff? You
mm,
might actually have people who have true physical athletic demand combined with knowing a game. And that's super exciting for me. Like I find that really, really fascinating. And you're seeing VR becoming more and more of a norm. Like it's only going to go one way. So
Hmm.
yeah,
That's
maybe for another time.
I hadn't even thought about that. We will definitely that'll be the next one for sure.
Yeah.
All right,
Cool.
man. Thanks for coming
All
on. I
right.
really appreciate
Yeah.
that.
It's great talking to you again. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Hey, anyone go check out Respawn Therapy on Instagram, respawn.therapy. Yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
Sweet. All
At
right.
Respawn Therapy. Cool.
Sweet.
Thank you.
You have a good one, Jordan.
You too, Ian. Bye.
Peace.